1961, in the locked-back ward of the Institute of Living in Hartford, Connecticut, a 17-year-old patient was considered, by every doctor treating her, beyond help. She had been admitted after years of self-injury. She had attempted suicide multiple times. She would attempt it again, inside the institution. The staff placed her in seclusion. They diagnosed her with schizophrenia, the wrong diagnosis as it would turn out. They treated her with the best methods of the time, which were not much. After more than 2 years on the locked ward, she was discharged no better than when she had come in. Her parents took her home. The professionals had given up. The patient's name was Marsha Linehan. She did not die. She survived against the long odds. She enrolled in college. She earned a doctorate in psychology in 1971. She went on to develop in the 1980s what is now considered one of the most effective treatments for chronically suicidal patients ever invented, dialectical behavior therapy. She is, today, one of the most influential clinical psychologists of the last 100 years. And in 2011, she did something almost no one in her field had ever done. She told the New York Times who she had been in that institution 50 years earlier. She did it because she had spent her career trying to articulate one hard idea, and she could not articulate it anymore without telling the story. The idea is this: the well-meaning people who tried to save her in that institution, the doctors, the nurses, the therapists, were not just ineffective. They were, in many cases, making her worse. Their attempts to fix her while she was drowning communicated something she could not bear to hear. They communicated that she was a problem to be solved, and the shame that produced drove her deeper into the dark. What eventually worked for Linehan, and what became the foundation of the treatment she would later build for others, was the opposite move: radical acceptance. The willingness to sit with another person as they actually are. The acknowledgement that you are not their solution. The recognition that for certain people, trying to be the solution is the very thing keeping them stuck. This is a video about 6 patterns of people you cannot save by trying harder. Before I name them, I want to be honest with you about what this video is and what it is not. There are versions of this idea, and there are a lot of them on this platform, that frame this as cold strategy. Cut these people off. Protect your peace. Stop being a fool. That is not what the research says. That is not what Marsha Linehan learned in that institution, and that is not what this video is going to do. What I am going to do is name 6 real patterns drawn from clinical research, family systems theory, and decades of documented case studies, where the act of trying to rescue someone usually fails, where the help, no matter how loving, cannot reach. I will tell you for each one what the science actually says, and what loving someone inside one of these patterns looks like when you stop trying to be their answer. And then, at the end, I will be honest about how this exact framework can be turned into something ugly, because it can. This is not a video about who to cut off. It is a video about how to love the people you are not equipped to save. The first, the person who has not yet decided. In 1983, 2 American psychologists, James Prochaska and Carlo Di Clemente, published a paper that would quietly reshape the way addiction and behavior change are understood for the next 40 years. They had been studying smokers, what made some succeed in quitting and others fail. What they found was so simple, it took them years to get anyone to listen. People do not change in a single moment. They move through stages, 5 of them: pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, action, and maintenance. And the most important of these is the first. In pre-contemplation, the person does not yet see a problem to solve. The drinking is not in their mind a problem. The relationship is not in their mind a problem. The pattern that is quietly destroying them is, in their mind, not the issue. They have not yet decided. Prochaska and Di Clemente's research showed something that has been replicated across decades. Interventions aimed at someone in pre-contemplation fail at extraordinarily high rates, not because the interventions are bad, but because they are arriving at the wrong moment. You cannot move someone from pre-contemplation by giving them better arguments. You cannot move them with intervention. You cannot move them, in most cases, with love. They have to move themselves. If the person you are trying to save is in pre-contemplation, if they do not yet experience their pattern as the problem, your saving will not land. It will exhaust you. It will sometimes push them deeper into denial, because every conversation about the problem becomes a thing to defend against. You can love them. You can stay alive in their life. You can keep the door open for the day they reach contemplation. What you cannot do is decide for them. This is the first pattern. The person who has not yet decided. On December the 14th, 1861, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha died of what the contemporary doctors called typhoid fever. He was 42 years old. His widow, Queen Victoria, was 42 also. For the remaining 40 years of her life, until her own death in 1901, she wore black. She avoided most public engagements. She insisted that Albert's rooms be kept exactly as he had left them, and that a photograph of him be placed beside her bed each night. She withdrew so completely from public life that her ministers, and eventually the public, began to refer to her as the Widow of Windsor. For decades, she could not let him go. This was not grief in the ordinary sense. This was something else. Victoria had taken her suffering and built it into her identity. The mourning had become who she was. To release the grief would have been, in her mind, to release Albert, and she was not willing. In modern clinical literature, this pattern has a name. The psychologist Holly Prigerson, working out of Weill Cornell, has spent decades documenting what is now formally recognized as prolonged grief disorder. Her research has shown that some grief becomes pathological precisely because letting it go would mean losing the deceased entirely. The mourner clings to the suffering because the suffering has become their last remaining bridge to the person they lost. The same pattern can attach to other kinds of pain: illness, trauma, betrayal. Some people have been hurt so deeply that the hurt has become organizing. Their identity, their relationships, their sense of meaning, all of it is now built around the wound. To heal them would mean asking them to surrender the structure of their life. You cannot rescue someone who has organized themselves around their suffering. You can sit with them. You can witness. What you cannot do is take the wound away, because the wound by now is part of who they are. You will recognize this one without needing the research. The phone call at midnight, the job lost, the relationship that imploded, the financial crisis, the injury, the mistake, the new disaster. You drop what you are doing. You show up. You help. The crisis passes. Then, 6 months later, a different version of the same crisis arrives. A different partner, the same dynamic. A different employer, the same firing. A different scam, the same loss. You help again, slightly more tired. 6 months after that, a third iteration, a fourth. Aaron Beck, the American psychiatrist who founded cognitive therapy in the 1960s, spent his career documenting the way humans run on patterns formed in childhood. He called these patterns schemas. The schemas, his research showed, are the deep templates through which a person sees the world, and they explain why people so often replicate in adulthood the dynamics they grew up inside, even when those dynamics hurt them, even when they have promised themselves in good faith that it will not happen again. A repeating pattern is not a series of bad luck events. It is a structural feature of someone's psychology, and it will not yield to repeated rescue. Your saving the person from the first crisis does not save them from the second, because the second is being generated by the same internal material as the first. When you are deciding whether to step in for the fourth or fifth time, the question is not whether the person deserves your help. They almost always do. The question is whether your help can reach the thing producing the crises. If it cannot, if you are responding to wave after wave while the tide goes on unchanged, you are spending yourself on the surface of a problem that lives somewhere deeper. The person in this pattern usually needs professional help. You are not it. There is a particular kind of relationship in which one person becomes everything for another, the only confidant, the only source of help, the only contact sometimes with the wider world. This is not always pathological. There are moments, illness, isolation, crisis, when someone temporarily leans on a single person, and that is appropriate. The problem is when it becomes permanent, when the dependent person has cut off or never built the wider net that healthy people have around them. In 1995, the American political scientist Robert Putnam published an essay called Bowling Alone that would later become a famous book. His finding, drawn from decades of social data, was that Americans had been steadily losing what he called social capital, the network of relationships that hold individuals up. Subsequent research on social network function has shown, with remarkable consistency, that adults with several to a dozen close ties are significantly healthier, mentally and physically, than adults with one or two. When you become someone's only world, you are not actually helping them. You are filling the role that an entire network should be filling, and you are bearing a weight that no single human can sustainably bear. The person you are saving is also, in this configuration, being slowly weakened, because the absence of other connection is part of what is keeping them stuck. The action here is not abandonment. The action is insistence on connection. You can love them and refuse to be their only world. You can support them while pushing them gently and persistently toward others, friends, family, professional help, community. What you cannot do, no matter how much you love them, is be the whole structure that holds another human being up. That has never been one person's job. It cannot be. This is the strangest of the 6 patterns, and the one most likely to break the heart of a kind person. You help. They are grateful at first. Then, weeks or months later, you notice a shift. They become cold. They speak about you to others in a slightly cooler tone. They find small ways to undercut you, or they create a conflict that, examined closely, has no real cause. You wonder what you did wrong. You did nothing wrong. You helped them. The Austrian-American psychoanalyst Heinz Kohut, writing in the 1960s and 70s, documented what he called narcissistic injury, the deep psychological wound that some people sustain when their inadequacy is exposed. When you help such a person, you do not register to them as a gift. You register as evidence of their failure. The help is humiliating, and to defend against the humiliation, they must, at some level, diminish you. This is not malice in the way that ordinary betrayal is malice. It is shame, operating through a person who has no other way to manage it. The modern researcher Brené Brown, who has done more than anyone to bring the science of shame into mainstream understanding, has written extensively about how shame turns inward to self-attack and outward to attack of others, often whichever target is closest. If your help is being met, repeatedly, with resentment or sabotage, the issue is not that you are helping wrong. The issue is that the help itself is hitting an old wound. You cannot save someone whose pain is activated by being saved. You can offer presence that does not feel to them like rescue. You can be in their life without being above them in it. What you cannot do is keep offering the kind of help that they will, every time, turn into evidence of their own inadequacy. This is the hardest of the 6 because it is the one that requires you to turn around and look at yourself. Sometimes the person you are trying to save has not, in fact, asked to be saved. You decided. You looked at their life from the outside, identified the problem, and appointed yourself as the answer. You assumed that what they needed was you. It is worth occasionally sitting with that assumption. The German-American psychoanalyst Karen Horney, writing in the 1940s, identified a personality pattern she called moving toward people, the chronically helpful person who derives identity, security, and a sense of worth from being needed. She was careful not to call this pattern evil. She called it neurotic, a defensive structure formed in childhood, often by people who were never themselves cared for in the way they deserved. If you are watching this and recognizing yourself in the role of the perpetual helper, it may be worth asking a question that the Stop Saving People genre of video almost never asks. What are you getting from this? What need is your helping meeting in you? What would you have to feel if you stopped? This is not an accusation. It is an invitation. Many of the most generous people on earth are also people whose generosity is, in part, a way of avoiding their own pain. The work is not to stop being generous. The work is to give the generosity a foundation that is not built on hunger. The person you are trying to save may not be your project. They may just be your neighbor. Now I have to be honest with you about how this framework can be used to do real harm, because it can, and it often is. There is a version of this video, and 1,000 others like it on this platform, that uses the language of patterns and boundaries to license something that is not wisdom. They were in pre-contemplation, so I ghosted them. They had a schema, so I left. They had a narcissistic injury, so I disappeared. The vocabulary becomes a way of dressing up abandonment in clinical clothes. This is not what Marsha Linehan meant by radical acceptance. This is not what Prochaska meant by stages of change. This is not what Horney meant by examining your own helping. The researchers I have walked you through tonight are, almost without exception, people who kept caring, who kept showing up for the hardest patients, the most difficult cases, the people who had been written off. Linehan built a treatment for the people the rest of the profession had given up on. Beck spent his life trying to give cognitive tools to people who had run out of hope. Prigerson keeps her practice with the grieving. They did not learn what they learned by walking away. They learned it by staying, and slowly figuring out what kind of staying actually helps. If you take from this video the lesson that you should withdraw from the difficult people in your life, you have learned the wrong lesson. The right lesson is harder. The right lesson is that your form of helping, the rushing in, the rescuing, the being the answer, may not be the help that reaches, and the kind of help that does reach, for these patterns, is usually quieter, less heroic, more patient, staying alive in someone's life without trying to fix them, recommending the professional help you are not qualified to give, loving them at a distance that is sustainable for you. The phrase, "never save these 6 types of people," is, frankly, too strong. It is the kind of phrase YouTube rewards because it sounds like cold strategy. The truth is gentler and more difficult. You can love them. You can love them deeply. What you cannot do is be the person who lifts them, single-handedly, out of themselves. That person, in the end, does not exist. Even Marsha Linehan, in that institution in 1961, was not lifted out by anyone. She climbed. What you have seen tonight are 6 patterns. They are not categories of person to be labeled and discarded. They are mirrors, held up to your own urge to rescue, telling you something about where that urge will and will not reach. You are not responsible for the climb another person, in the end, must make alone. You are responsible for what kind of light you leave on, in the window, while they make it. Marsha Linehan was not lifted out. She climbed. The people you love will climb, or they will not. Your job is to be the one who is still there, awake and waiting, on the morning they decide to begin.